Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 15th session of the PWL International Seminar. This is the permanent seminar of the FCT funding project, Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, an Ancient Model, a Contemporary Approach, and it is hosted by IFILNOVA at the Nova University of Lisbon. This is also the last session of this academic year, and I believe we close this series with a golden key. It is really a great joy and honor for us to have with us today Michael Chase, who is a very well-known person for all of us working on PWL. Michael has in particular translated most of Hado's work into English, and we cannot thank you enough for that. We couldn't be having this seminar, this whole series of seminars in English with so many quotes of Hado without your work. So thank you so much for that tremendous gift. I will now, as usual, very shortly introduce our guest for those who might not know him so well. So Michael Chase is a researcher at the CNRS Centre Jean Pépin in Paris and a visiting scholar at Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. He was trained as a classical scholar and has published widely in the history of Greek, Latin, and Islamic philosophy and their relations to contemporary science. As a student of Pierre Hadot, he has translated, as already mentioned, 6 of Hadot's books into English, the most recent of which is Don't Forget to Live, Goethe and the Tradition of Spiritual Exercises, published last year with the University of Chicago Press. He is also co-editor of the volume Philosophy as a Way of Life, Ancient and Moderns, Essays in Honor of Pierre Hadot, published with Blackwell in 2013. And more recently, with Matthew Sharp and Eli Kramer, he has co-founded, not funded, the Brill series, Philosophy as a Way of Life, Texts and Studies, which he also co-directs at the moment. He teaches regularly on PWL, not only in Paris, but also a visiting scholar or visiting professor in Mexico, Brazil, Japan, and Italy, among other places. Michael Chase frequently likes to cross his work on PWL with contemporary science, and his talk will reflect his approach today. The title is Notes on PWL, Quantum Physics and Epistemic Modesty. So Michael, thank you again for accepting this invitation, and please, when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marta. Once again, it's such an honor to be involved in this series and to have giving the last talk of the year. Just one moment and I'll see if I can set this up correctly. One would think that after all these years of using Zoom, I'd be better at it than I am, but there we go.
We are seeing your presenter view mode. Is that?
Oh, that's not good. Okay, well, I'll use that then.
Now
how's that? Is that better?
Fine, yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Now let me see here. Okay. So, thanks everybody for joining us. And as Marta so eloquently and generously stated, I am going to be talking a little bit about the links between PWL and contemporary science, in this case, quantum physics. Now, a preliminary disclaimer, I am not a scientist. I am not an expert in quantum physics, but I am interested in it. And so I have, I guess, a dilettante's interest in quantum physics, and I've done my best to understand the popular scientific literature. So I'm interested in it because I want to see whether the findings, some aspects of Pierre Hadot's theory of philosophy as a way of life, may or may not be compatible with some of the findings of quantum physics as I understand them. So, obviously, I don't have to explain to everybody here what the PWL is, although I will make a couple of remarks about my understanding of PWL as we proceed. So, part of this general problematic that I'm going to be talking about fits within the more broader problematic of updating. To what extent must the views of ancient Greco-Roman thought be modified to make them appropriate for life today? Now, some key concepts of PWL, such as free will, the existence of free will as opposed to universal determinism, may be reinforced by quantum physics. I won't talk much about that, but I think it's quite a very important point. Others, and this is what we're going to be concentrating on here, such as the notions of objectivity and disinterestedness, seem to be challenged by the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics. Also challenged by QP, quantum physics, is the claim that science should aim to achieve always and everywhere apodictic certainty. Instead, I'm going to argue QP may reinforce the idea of epistemic modesty. So just briefly to go over some well-known points, the starting point of philosophy as a way of life is that philosophy, rather than the development of a primarily theoretical discourse, must aim at the transformation of the individual. It's mainly concerned with helping us to transform our way of seeing and perceiving the world. And according to Pierre Hadot, this transformation in the best case scenario can go so far as to change a subject's way of being, thus allowing her to live a life that is more autonomous, free, and happy. Once again, Hadot takes up this ancient Platonic idea of grades of being, degrees of being, to argue that PWL, at the best, can even help its practitioners exist in a way that is more intense and authentic. Now, Hadot's formulation of these ideas, as we all know, was based on his understanding and study of ancient Greco-Roman philosophy, and his philological background is vital for a full understanding of his views about philosophy as a way of life. One important aspect of Hadot's thought, which I've tried to emphasize, is his idea of the levels of the self. We've seen that the goal of PWL is transformation, brought about by a change in our perspective. And underlying this idea is Hadot's notion that there are different levels of the self. On the one hand, there's the default self, or the piccolo self, as I call it, following the Italian philosopher Guido Cusinato, at which level we consider ourselves to be isolated beings situated in an indifferent or a hostile world. And we usually identify this self with our own narrative history, our personal experiences, hopes, fears, ambitions, desires, and so forth. According to this view, we tend to think that the world revolves around us, and we judge it according to what we perceive as our usually short-term interests. What benefits me is good, what is disadvantageous to me is bad. Now, Hadot, on my interpretation, denies that this is the only self there is. He believes that there is such a thing. We believe that there is such a thing as a higher self, which resembles the logos of the Stoics or the daimon of Marcus Aurelius and Plotinus, and is paradoxically both the deepest, most authentic part of us, and in some sense it also transcends us. Its outlook is universal and objective, Hadot says. It sees the forest rather than the trees and is constantly aware of our connection to our fellow human beings, to nature, and to the entire cosmos. Now, this sense of connection with and oneness with the universe is, I think, one of the main things that Hadot meant by cosmic consciousness, the achievement of which is one of the main goals of spiritual exercises and of philosophy as a way of life. Now, Hadot knew that it's necessary to periodically update philosophy as a way of life, because the ancient texts on which this philosophical trend is based are the products of arguably outdated worldviews in several respects. Some examples: the ancient Greeks and Romans thought of the Earth as an insignificant planet, which is true, but they thought it was situated at the bottom of the universe and that the sun and the other celestial bodies revolve around it. They considered these celestial bodies, most of them did, who consist of a substance called aether, an element different from the four elements that compose the sublunar world and does not obey the same laws. They considered these planets to be gods. Now, the Stoics, for another example, believe that the world is ruled by a rational but material fiery spirit called the pneuma, which is consubstantial with the logos, or reason, that is the essential core of human nature, also known as fate, nature, or Zeus. This pneuma, or logos, exercises benevolent, providential care over the world and everything in it. Finally, on a social level, almost all Greco-Roman thinkers assume that slavery is legitimate and that women are inferior to men. Now, some of these views range from what we may consider as quaint and possibly outdated, such as the existence of a providential universe, to what is abhorrent and unjustifiable, the legitimacy of slavery and the inferiority of women. Now, we can't accept these views, I would argue. Therefore, if we still want to adopt some form of Greco-Roman philosophical doctrines, we have to find a way to bracket or eliminate such elements from our updated version of PWL. But this is hard. The ancients themselves emphasized that the three parts of philosophy, logic, physics, and ethics, are indissociable and cannot be conceived, much less practiced, independently of each other. And I think that some forms of modern Stoicism, which is very prevalent nowadays, might be guilty of cherry-picking some aspects of Stoic thought, transforming it into a collection of isolated self-help sayings. And the end result is often an individualistic libertarian outlook that ignores the ethical, social, and physical aspects of ancient Stoicism. Anyway, the question we'll be focusing on here today is where on this spectrum of elements that need to be updated should the notion of objectivity be placed? Now, as Hadot, a quote first of all from Hadot, he writes that the problem of scientific objectivity is extremely interesting from the point of view of spiritual exercises. Since Aristotle, it has been recognized that science should be disinterested. To study a text or microbes or the stars, one must rid oneself of one's subjectivity. I think it is an ideal that one must attempt to attain through a certain practice. So for Hadot, as we know, one of his most basic and most famous controversial ideas is that what's fundamental in ancient philosophy is not so much the doctrines that each philosophical school came up with, as a concrete series of practical spiritual exercises intended to help the practitioner realize her itinerary of self-transformation. And as we all know, these spiritual exercises could range from the modification and amelioration of some of our character traits or character defects to what Hadot called cosmic consciousness. And as I mentioned before, this state of cosmic consciousness is the perception of the individual's indissoluble unity with the whole of reality. Or it can also be viewed as an access to a more universal self, less obsessed with egocentric gratification, as opposed to what Guido Cusinato called the piccolo self. Now, Hadot argues that if we can cease, temporarily or permanently, to identify unquestioningly with this piccolo self, we can achieve what Hadot called objectivity. Henceforth, freed from the blinders imposed by our prejudices and selfishness, we are able to see the world, perhaps for the first time, as it is in itself. Now, here's another quote from Hadot. What will be required is, on the one hand, a conscious, complete engagement of the self, and on the other, a complete detachment from the self, a deliberate objectivity and impartiality. It is only this ascesis of scientific rigor, this detachment from the self, required by an objective, impartial judgment, that can give us the right to involve ourselves in history and give it an existential meaning. So as we saw at the outset, Hadot, as the author of critical editions of both Greek and Latin texts, held that the close study of ancient texts was a critical part of what we could call the spiritual exercise of philological objectivity. And as we have also seen, the study of history for Hadot requires that the historian strive for a coincidence of opposites, coincidentia oppositorum. Hadot believes that there is such a thing as authorial intention in the study of ancient texts, and it should be a main part of the historian's task to approximate it as close as possible. And he has written that he believes Nietzsche was simply wrong on this point. Not all interpretations of texts from the past are equally permissible, and some are simply wrong. One more quotation from Hadot. If one tries to understand a text objectively, he writes, I believe that afterward one can be brought almost spontaneously to discover its human meaning, that is, to situate it in relation to the general problem of humanity. One can do as the Stoics did concerning their representations. First, one begins with an adequate and objective judgment. This is what was said. Then, eventually, make a value judgment. This has a special significance for my life. This time one can speak of a return to subjectivity, a subjectivity that moreover attempts to elevate itself to a universal perspective. So we have an almost Hegelian dialectic here between ridding oneself of oneself, as it were, and returning to that self. But on this stage now, this self has been able to acquire an objective point of view. So once again, this 2-point process that Hadot outlines. First, we try to determine what the text means, the ancient text means. This means trying to determine the author's intention. And to find it, the philologist has to begin by bracketing her own subjectivity. Has to use the philological methods of establishing the best readings from all available manuscripts, and then use all the appropriate auxiliary sciences to establish the objective meaning of the text in question. Then one has to situate it within the author's historical period, with its specific social economic conditions, and one has to determine the work's literary genre and its intended audience, and so forth and so on. So a lot of work. But only when the text's objective meaning has thus been determined, says Hadot, do we have the right to ask, what does this ancient text mean to me? And here is where the hard problems emerge of the need to update ancient texts by bracketing or replacing elements that are no longer relevant. So it's this operation of bracketing, I want to argue, that makes the quest for objectivity a spiritual exercise. And I think I'm going to pass rather rapidly over this. I think there are parallels that could be drawn here between the act of reading and the act of writing commentaries on philosophical texts as spiritual exercises. And they are spiritual exercises precisely because they require us to bracket our own subjectivity for a second and concentrate on the text in question. But I won't go into that here. The Swiss scholar Gerard S. has written a very interesting book called Cosmic Consciousness for an Ecology in the First Person. Here he writes that transcribing a text, commenting upon it, or even translating it can be acts of what the philosopher, of what Hess calls the décentrement de soi, the decentering of oneself. Now we recall that Hadot interprets Socrates' definition of philosophy in the Phaedo as an exercise of, or training for, death, as, and I quote, an attempt to liberate ourselves from the partial passionate point of view, so as to rise to the universal. Training for death is training to die to one's own individuality and passions in order to look at things from the perspective of universality and objectivity. Here's that word again. Now, following Hadot, Gerard S. speaks of this decentering as a way to die to oneself, as a little death to one's narrative personal identity with its interests, beliefs, dispositions, and projects, and returning to a transcendental self. And here again, I think there's a lot of common points with the view of Guido Cusinato. Now, Hadot thinks that disinterestedness is a very important aspect of objectivity. In his last published work, which is his book on Goethe and spiritual exercises, Marta mentioned at the outset, Hadot speaks of a spiritual exercise characterized by that movement of detachment from oneself that transforms our thought and our action, a transformation of the relation to the real, a transfiguration of the everyday, which is a quote from Goethe. As other instances of the importance of disinterestedness, Hadot cites Aristotle's theoretical philosophy, and the idea attested in Cicero, Seneca, and the 20th century French biologist Jacques Monod, that philosophy is an ethics of disinterestedness and objectivity. And these scholars evaluate progress from the perspective of disinterested knowledge. There's also an epistemological disinterest, which consists in the pursuit of knowledge and learning for their own sake, as was practiced in Plato's Academy. There's also an ethical disinterestedness, which can mean refraining from placing one's own apparent personal interests before those of other human beings, as Haddo argued was done by certain Roman statesmen. And finally, when he embarks on one of his very relatively infrequent exercises of comparative philosophy, Haddo writes that in Greece, India, and China, what led to wisdom was the notion of indifference in the sense of the refusal to attribute value differences to things on the basis of our own individual, partial, limited, and egoistic preferences and prejudices. For the Chinese Taoist sage Zhang Zhu, disinterestedness leads to an original state of peace and mind and tranquility prior to the affirmation of our individuality against the world and against other people. As far as the ethics of disinterestedness is concerned, Haddo quotes Marcus Aurelius. What more do you want when you have benefited some human being? Isn't it enough for you to have done something in conformity with your nature? Do you want to get paid for that? It's as if an eye were to ask for compensation because it sees, or the feet because they walk. Now, what Marcus means by this, according to Haddo, is that acting in a humane, considerate way to others is natural for human beings because it's an act that is in accordance with human nature. But for any natural entity, acting in accordance with nature by fulfilling one's natural function does not require or deserve any other recompense. Therefore, for Marcus, goodness must be wholly allocentric, that is to say, other-directed. It must be perfectly disinterested, inwardly free, and not attached to what it is accomplishing. So, disinterestedness for Marcus Aurelius, on Haddo's interpretation, corresponds to performing morally good acts without any ulterior motive of hoping to receive some benefit in return, even if it's only the feel-good kind of, the good feeling we get from having carried out a meritorious act. And here again, there's a parallel in Goethe. Goethe so admired Spinoza's dictum that he who truly loves God must not require him to love him in return, that Goethe wrote, "To be disinterested, uneigennützig, in everything, but most of all in love and friendship, was my highest pleasure, my maxim, my exercise." Now, some of these ideas go back to Kant, who was probably the most important source for Haddo's conception of disinterestedness. For Kant, the pleasure we derive from the beauties of nature is a disinterested interest, because a good-souled person derives pleasure from the form and existence of natural beings without the intervention, says Kant, of sensual attraction or an end she herself attaches to it. So for Kant, the delight or the satisfaction, the Wohlgefallen, one derives from beauty is without any interest. Uninteressiertes, that is to say, it's entirely pure and free from any admixture of stimuli and emotions. Now, I'm going to go over this quickly because I've talked about it elsewhere. One of the ways that Haddo thinks we can actualize cosmic consciousness today is through artistic experience and the philosophical interpretations of modern art that are made by people like Bergson and Merleau-Ponty. The argument here is that art can help us cast a disinterested gaze on reality, in which we forget our usual judgments, which are based on evaluating the world in terms of our own interests and benefits, and we manage to perceive the world for itself, no longer as a function of its meaning, value, and interest for us. And Haddo argues that this kind of aesthetic gaze on reality can enable us to see the world once again as if it were for the first time. So that's my brief summary of Haddo's attitudes and the reasons why, for him, objectivity and disinterestedness are so important. Now I want to turn to what some of the implications on this view may be that we can derive from contemporary science in general and quantum mechanics in particular. I think that Haddo's disagreement with people like Foucault, Barthes, and others who deny the importance of authorial intention and claim that the author is dead, I think that this disagreement is not fatal to PWL. Whether or not there is such a thing as authorial intention and whether it's important to pursue it is a moot point, I think, and good arguments can and have been made on both sides. But potentially more serious objections against Haddo's emphasis on the importance of objectivity may arise from the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics. Now, this interpretation challenges our standard notion of objectivity in several ways, and I'm going to focus on two of them here. First is the fact that an act of experimental measurement irreversibly perturbs the state of the system being observed. And secondly, that it is impossible to simultaneously determine complementary properties of submolecular particles with arbitrary precision. I'll go on to try to explain what I mean by that. Now, the Nobel Prize winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli wrote that in microphysics, each observation is an intervention of indeterminable extent, both in the means of observation and in the system observed, and it interrupts the causal connection between the phenomena that precede and follow it. The uncontrollable interaction between observer and observed system on the occasion of every measurement therefore makes the deterministic conception of phenomena, which is presupposed in classical physics, impracticable. I'll add here that it's awfully strange to see contemporary physicists, people like Sabine Hossenfelder, for instance, happily talking about how science has proved that the universal determinism is true in every aspect of our life, therefore there's no free will. Oh, and yes, there is quantum mechanics, which does prove that there is indeterminism, but never mind. But the fact is that if we can prove that there is a single phenomenon in the world which is not determined, then determinism is false, it seems to me. Anyway, we're not going to go into that here. In classical physics, an observer's measurement of an experimental setup is thought to have a negligible effect on the phenomena observed. We can, according to classical physics, we can look at things, observe them, without having an effect on what we're looking at. In quantum theory, however, the act of measuring irreversibly perturbs the state of the system observed, and it does so to an extent which cannot be predicted beforehand. Now, the theorists of QT give different interpretations of this fact, but the upshot of it is that the classical paradigm of a scientist observing an experiment in a detached, objective way without her observation affecting the phenomena themselves may be considered, at least on the micro level, obsolete. The second idea I want to examine here is Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, or better, indeterminacy. This famous principle states that there are pairs of properties of submolecular particles. Examples include position and momentum, energy and time, etc., which are known as complementary or conjugate, such that they cannot be measured simultaneously to an arbitrary degree of precision. In other words, the more accurately one measures one of these properties, the less accurately one can measure the other. Now, for someone like Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, who was a student and friend of Heisenberg, when the scientist wants to know a quantum property in a determinate way, she must renounce the knowledge of the property that's complementary thereto. In other words, if you want to study the position of a submolecular particle to a very high degree of accuracy, then you cannot know its momentum to a very high degree of accuracy. You've got to choose. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So Weizsäcker derives from this fact the conclusion that the renunciation of objectivity of the classical description of nature may be seen as definitive. Weizsäcker also speaks, interestingly, of a quantum mechanical not knowing, nicht wissen, which is reminiscent of the tradition of Docta Ignorantia, which we know from Nicholas of Cusa, but which goes back through Meister Eckhart to Greek Neoplatonism in general and Porphyry of Tyre in particular. So this kind of Nicht wissen, this not knowing, which some have derived from the findings of quantum mechanics, seems to be a manifestation of the long tradition of epistemic modesty, which I'm going to talk about a little bit at the end of my talk. Now, for Heisenberg, as for his teacher Niels Bohr, the reason why the micro world cannot be objectified, that is to say, it can't be visualized, it cannot be made understandable and communicated in language, has to do with the links between thought, language, and the limits that it imposes on our knowledge. And the key theme from now on is going, and I think it's common to quantum mechanics and to Hadot, is the idea that our cognitive categories in language were adapted to deal with the spatio-temporal world of our everyday experience, but they are not apt for the quantum world, which is essentially non-spatial and atemporal. Therefore, the problem is that we're often led astray by homonymy, the fact that the same words often do not mean the same thing when referring to the micro and the macro world. Now, in this context, Heisenberg makes what I think is a very interesting distinction between things that are objective and things that are real. Things can be objective but not real. Quantum mechanics prior to measurement. Or conversely, real but not objective, the same particles after measurement, and hence the entire macro world in which we live. Heisenberg's reasons for thinking this are rather complex, and I won't go into them in any detail, but the general idea is that something can be a quantum state prior to being measured by an observer, exists in a state of superposition in which it can contain contradictory qualities. When this is what he means by being objective. However, we can't really know much about that state. We can only know that state when we measure it. When we do measure it, however, scientists say that the wave packet collapses, which is to say that of all these possible properties that the quantum object possesses, only one becomes actualized and real. So in that sense, after measurement, a quantum system is real, but it's not objective because it contains, as a part of its description from now on, the way that information about it was obtained by the scientist. And that's the subjective element. So in the world of science, of quantum physics, after measurement, we have an inextricable mixing of subjective and objective elements, according to Heisenberg. So for Heisenberg, objective, as I said, means the elimination of all subjective elements. So when the scientist describes the results of her observations, her characterization of the system under study not only specifies the properties of that system, but also, and I quote, contains information about the extent of the observer's knowledge of this system. So it's this mixture of subjective and objective elements in the scientist's description that for Heisenberg means that the use of the word objective for the characterization of the quantum system by the ensemble is problematical. So as I tried to explain before, an isolated quantum system, that is to say a quantum system prior to being measured, can be called objective because it's free from any connection with human knowledge, and hence all subjectivity. However, such a system is not yet real. It is, says Heisenberg, completely abstract and incomprehensible since it has not yet been measured. That is to say, it hasn't had a number attached to it. It hasn't been situated between the spatio-temporal world in which we live. Prior to measurement, then, such a system is objective but not real, or in the Aristotelian terminology, which Heisenberg sometimes likes to use, it's not actual, but it's still potential. This same quantum system, however, once it's measured, has already made the transition from a potential to an actual state. So, in that sense, it can now be considered real. But it is, ipso facto, no longer objective. So, in this case, we could say that being subjective and being objective, existing in a real way and an objective way, are complementary qualities. And we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So, in quantum theory, quantum systems are not objective, or cannot, that is to say, they cannot be objectified, because it's two states: potential, which is described by abstract mathematics, and actual, described by spatiotemporal properties, are complementary in the sense that was described by Niels Bohr. And this means that both states, when they're complementary, are essential components of the system in question, and they're necessary for us to describe it completely. But they can't hold true at the same time and in the same respect. So that a description in terms of either one of these two states excludes any possibility of its simultaneous description in terms of the other state. So Heisenberg gives us an example of this, the study of a thermodynamic system. If you take a subsystem of a room full of gas, you have a choice. You can either study the movement of each individual molecule, or you can study this quantity of gas as a whole in terms of its temperature. But you can't do both. If you do one, then you can't do the other. And that's what Bohr and Heisenberg mean by saying of something that it is, that it contains complementary properties, which are mutually contradictory, but both necessary for the complete description of a system. Heisenberg writes, if we attempt to penetrate behind this reality into the details of atomic events, the contours of this objectively real world dissolve, not into the mist of a new and as yet unclear idea of reality, but in the transparent clarity of a mathematics whose laws govern the possible and not the actual. At this point, we realize the simple fact that natural science is not nature itself, but a part of the relation between man and nature, and is therefore dependent on man. So one of the implications of this view of things is that the scientist's description of a quantum system is always necessarily incomplete. The laws of microscopic nature, of the way nature behaves on a microscopic level, must be statistical. And the scientist's predictions can henceforth only be given in terms of probabilities. So I think this is an instance of what I've called epistemic modesty. The nature of the microworld and of human cognitive capacities thus force us to adopt a version of epistemic modesty. Our knowledge of the quantum world can never, even in principle, be complete or absolute. And I think it's important to realize how much this contrasts with what one can call the standard picture of physics as it existed from the period of Galileo and Descartes until the 1900, when Max Planck introduced the idea of the quantum. Oops, I'm going too fast now. One of Heisenberg's best students and closest friends later in life was Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. And he wrote that a fundamental logical property of quantum theory is that the type of our knowledge of nature, Art der Kenntnis, and the way it was obtained must be included in statements of experimental findings. We can go even farther. We can say that, in a sense, the way that the knowledge of a system was obtained is actually a property of that system. And if we don't include in our description of that system the way in which the knowledge was obtained, then we're not providing a complete description. Weizsäcker writes that the presupposition of the objective existence of the objects of our knowledge is a mere item of faith. QT has shown that the assertion that objects really exist, quote unquote, independently of our knowledge is highly debatable. Measurement or observation are processes in which one gains information about certain aspects of nature and reality at the cost of renouncing knowledge about certain other complementary aspects. So, as Heisenberg showed, this means that in the transition from classical physics to QT, the goal of scientific knowledge is now shifted from certitude to probability. Another one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics was Wolfgang Pauli, who won the Nobel Prize in 1945. He wrote, I consider the unpredictable change of the state by a single observation, of a quantum system that is, to be an abandonment of the idea of the isolation, detachment of the observer from the course of physical effects outside himself. There one might compare what I've described at the outset as the default view of modern humanity. We tend to think of ourselves as isolated from in the midst of a hostile environment with which we have no connection? Well, quantum physics on the Copenhagen interpretation sheds a bit of doubt on that assumption. So we saw earlier on that Hadot emphasized the notion of detachment, very closely linked to his idea of disinterestedness. But now Wolfgang Pauli criticizes what he calls the ideal of the detached observer, which he claims was the viewpoint of classical physics still defended by Einstein. For Pauli, the main distinction between the conception of experimental observation in classical physics and in quantum theory is that both admit that the observer has an influence on the phenomena observed, but for classical physics, the effects of this influence can be calculated in advance and then accounted for by various scientific and mathematical gymnastics. They can be eliminated from the scientific reports of our observations. This is not the case in quantum theory, for which the influence of the observer on what is observed can't be calculated in advance and is therefore unpredictable. Pauli also wrote, whereas in classical physics, the observer must disappear entirely as a hidden spectator, nature being left alone in a predetermined course of events, independent of how phenomena are observed, quantum theory has shown that an observation hic et nunc, here and now, changes the state of the observed system in a way not contained in the mathematically formulated laws. So, as we glimpsed before, the fact that the observer somehow influences what she observes refutes the classical conception of a scientific observer as detached or isolated from the rest of the world. And for Pauli, this tendency in classical physics to eliminate the observer from science went hand to hand with what he calls the de-souling, the Entseelung of the cosmos. And it began with Johannes Kepler and then increased until the consolidation of quantum mechanics in the 1920s. In classical physics, it was held that objective knowledge of the way nature is and behaves can be obtained only by eliminating the subjectivity of the observer. And that was why Galileo, for instance, went back to Democritus and called for the elimination of so-called secondary qualities, such as colors, tastes, and smells, which are supposed to be, in some sense, illusory. The only thing that's real, quote unquote, in external reality is extension, speed, mass, and things like that. Excuse me. And one could argue that this is still a main characteristic of science today. This kind of prejudice, I think, can't be called anything else against secondary qualities. Pauli also wrote that as far as Einstein is concerned, that Einstein has the philosophical prejudice that for macroscopics, a so-called real state can be objectively defined in all circumstances without information on the order of experiment by means of which the system of macroscopic bodies is investigated. In other words, Einstein clings, according to Pauli, to the classical notion that the reality can perfectly well be described objectively and that we don't have to include, contrary to what Heisenberg and Weizsäcker says, when we describe a system, we don't have to include in our description the way in which that knowledge was obtained. In other words, there's no necessarily subjective element in our description. Pauli, who was a very acerbic critic, constantly targeted Einstein as the main proponent of this idea of the detached observer. Yet he even criticized his venerated teacher Niels Bohr for using the same terminology. For Pauli, on the contrary, the role of such detachment has decreased with the development of QT. And he hoped that this tendency would continue, since according to him, contemporary science is still too detached. Now, as he corresponded with Niels Bohr, however, he eventually came to concede that there can be degrees of detachment. And these degrees are to be judged by measuring the informative reference to the observer that a description contains. So Pauli wound up being willing to distinguish between the idea of an objective description in a broad sense, which he accepts, and the idea of a detached observer, simpliciter, which he rejects. Pauli establishes two conditions for what he calls a valid objectivity. First of all, the observer's individual characteristics must not appear in the physical explanation of nature. And second, it's presupposed that once the observer has chosen an experimental arrangement, she cannot influence the result of observation. So this means that, unlike what a lot of people assume is the case in the Copenhagen interpretation, it is not the scientist's consciousness or observation that causes the collapse of the waves function. Instead, the scientist, by setting up an experiment in a specific way, determines whether an electron will appear, for instance, when measured, as a wave or as a particle. And this is where the notion of free will comes in. The results of an experiment depend on the way the scientist chooses to set up the experiment, and nothing in turn determines that choice. Now, because of these necessary conditions for objectivity, Pauli believes that quantum theory must limit itself to predicting statistical, law-abiding behavior. That is to say, as we've seen already, probabilities rather than certainties. And this entails that the scientist must sacrifice the individual case. The reason for this is because statistics and the probabilities that derive from them are necessarily based on the study of the results of a large number of experiments, carried out under some initial conditions that are as similar as possible. But this means that any individual experimental result thus remains outside the realm of the scientific. Thus, for Pauli too, there is a kind of a quantum mechanical not knowing, a Nichtwissen, but it's different from the one sketched by the young Weizsäcker. For Weizsäcker, quantum theory requires renunciation in the sense that if I decide to measure the position of a quantum particle with high accuracy, I thereby renounce the possibility of knowing with high accuracy its conjugate or complementary property of momentum. For Pauli, in contrast, this renunciation concerns scientific knowledge of individual experimental results. Like Heisenberg and Weizsäcker, Pauli interprets QT as demanding a restriction on what human beings can know scientifically. But as we've seen, for him, it was the knowledge of individual things, events, and processes that must be renounced. Pauli thought this feature of science as revealed by QT was problematic, and in that sense, Einstein was right when he contended that quantum mechanics is incomplete. But for Pauli, the way to compensate for this was not to go back to the objectivist presuppositions of classical physics, but to return to the symbolic, rather carry out a symbolic extension of physical concepts to the realm of psychology, assimilating the hidden world of quantum phenomena to Jung's world of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. I won't go further into that here, but it's a very interesting theory. Pauli was himself analyzed by Jung, and the two of them carried out a long correspondence and even published a few interesting articles together. So, what do we draw from all of this? My conclusion would be that while some aspects of some interpretations of quantum theory, particularly the Copenhagen interpretation, may pose certain difficulties for Haddo's conception of objectivity, detachment, and disinterestedness, they may not be fatal. Bohr, Heisenberg, Pauli, and Weizsäcker maintain that the notion of objectivity, as formulated in classical physics, is henceforth obsolete. However, that doesn't mean that we should just toss out the notion of objectivity like the baby with the bathwater. Bohr, as we saw, was the first to question the usefulness of talking about what reality might be like, apart from our scientific observations and measurements of it. Even so, he continued until the end of his life to seek a science that would be free from subjective distortions. Heisenberg was more willing than Bohr to speculate on what nature or objective reality might be like in itself. And he suggested using the Aristotelian conceptions of potentiality and actuality to explain what happens when scientists carry out observations or measurements of quantum phenomena. The young von Weizsäcker interpreted quantum mechanics as leading to a kind of quantum mechanical not knowing. Finally, Pauli, while rejecting the idea of the detached observer as it appears in classical physics and in Einstein's thought, nevertheless sought to retain the notion of objectivity and posed strict conditions for its preservation. Ultimately, like Pierre Hadot, Pauli held the characteristics of the individual scientist's personality must not be allowed to be reflected in scientific theories and the statement of scientific results. This seems to imply a kind of ascesis or spiritual exercise by means of which the scientist brackets her personality. Marta, how am I doing with time? Do I still have a couple of moments?
Yes, you do. Still 7 minutes or so.
Thank you. Oh, great. Okay. So, Hadot's notion of scientific objectivity as a spiritual exercise, I would argue, thus seems to be broadly compatible with the views of these exponents of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. One important aspect that Hadot shows with these scientists is his idea of the limits of discursive thought and hence of the limits of language. As we know, Hadot, who was the first scholar in France to talk about Wittgenstein, often emphasized the problems entailed by the limits of language. Now, Bohr and Heisenberg, for their part, repeatedly explained that the difficulties we have in understanding quantum phenomena are due in large part to the fact that the language and the concepts we have to use to explain and describe such phenomena are adopted to describe the sensible world of everyday phenomena, which, as QT shows, follows very different laws from those that govern the submolecular world. Weizsäcker, influenced by his study of Plato, including the unwritten doctrines, came to believe that a different kind of thought, holistic, contemplative, and meditative or mystical, rather than discursive or calculating, is necessary to grasp the unity of reality. Pauli, as we've seen, following Jung, advocated a descent into the archetypes of the collective unconscious and the decipherment of dreams and symbols. And I think that if we want to compare Hadot's position, his views are more compatible with what I consider the Neo-Platonian rationalism of Weizsäcker than with the theurgico-gnostic thought of Wolfgang Pauli. Ultimately, the apparent tension between Hadot and the Copenhagen interpretation of QT may boil down to the homonymy of the notion of objectivity. What the Copenhagen scholars, scientists, meant by objective was that which can be objectified. That is to say, conceptualized, described, and communicated, or in other words, rendered intuitive or visualizable, anschaulich, in accordance with our spatiotemporal characters and categories of perception and independently of any contamination of human subjectivity. So for these scientists, there is a difference between objectification, which they consider to be characteristic of classical physics and to have been bypassed by quantum physics, and objectivity, which they still generally consider to be a good thing, something we should strive after. Hadot, for his part, also stressed that objectivity is to be acquired by the bracketing or suppression of subjective features of the scientist's personality. But he usually meant by objectivity seeing the way things are in themselves, independently of the personal characteristics, prejudices, and interests of the observer. This understanding of objectivity coincides with that of some contemplative and spiritual traditions such as Zen Buddhism, in which the peak experience known as Kensho is said to provide insight into the world as it really is in its objectivity, and can also be described as an experience of the world as just this, thusness or suchness. For Gerard Hess, an objective viewpoint is equivalent to the viewpoint from nowhere, made famous by Thomas Nagel, the viewpoint of the universe or of the world as a totality. And for Hess, as for Hadot, as we've seen, achieving this viewpoint is the result of a decentering of ourselves that can be achieved only by, quote unquote, dying to ourselves. And that is by transcending the limits of what Guido Cusinato calls the piccolo self. And this decentering too can be understood as a form of renunciation. So both Hadot and some representatives of the Copenhagen school demand a renunciation of our usual identification of the piccolo self in the case of Hadot, and of our pretenses to a knowledge that is absolute, complete, and conditional in the case of the Copenhagen theorists. And this, I think, makes it legitimate to speak of the Copenhagen theorists as representatives of the tradition of epistemic modesty. And this was a tradition that rose in reaction to the claims by Plato and Aristotle that human reason is pretty well all-powerful. It's capable of obtaining certain knowledge of every aspect of reality. However, as I've tried to show elsewhere, beginning with the pre-Socratics and continuing through the empirist doctors and the philosophical tradition of the skeptics, alongside the Aristotelian Platonic tradition that emphasized reason and certainty, there was an underground tradition that never ceased to emphasize the limits of human reason, which, although it's perfectly adequate for understanding the features of the sensible world in which we live, may not be capable of sounding the ultimate mysteries of reality. So the great innovation, or perhaps revival, of the Copenhagen school was to suggest that these limits of knowledge, of knowability, of the highest metaphysical principles apply not only to possible human knowledge of the highest medical principles, as the ancient philosophical tradition held, and or of the divine, but also of those principles that operate on the smallest, most fundamental scales of reality. Matter turns out to be just as hard to understand as the first principles of the universe, and for the same reason. Our cognitive capacities have simply not evolved to be able to deal with them. Ancient philosophers already suspected that neither what is highest, God or the One or the forms or what have you, nor what is lowest, that is to say, matter and individuals, can be known with scientific certainty by purely rational demonstration. If they are knowable at all, it will have to be by means of some cognitive faculty or faculties other than pure reason. Now, the Neoplatonists spent centuries trying to develop a doctrine of what kind of faculty or faculties that might be, but in modern times, those efforts have been almost entirely neglected. Perhaps, I would argue, it may be time to revive them. Thanks so much for your patience and attention.
Thank you, Michael, for such a complex, challenging, and thought-provoking talk. We now have exactly 30 minutes for discussion. So if there are questions, yeah. I see already 3 raised hands. First, Gianfranco Ferraro.
Good evening, Professor Chase. Thank you very much for your communication. Also because it really, by personal and not so objective point of view, reinforcing me the idea that precisely our relation, our philosophical relation with contemporary physics can really get us approaching in a different way also what spiritual exercise can be, precisely in order to understand and to approach today's philosophy of science. So really, thank you. Well, I'm just I'm following contemporary, for instance, contemporary loop gravity physics, and with some authors as Liz Molin and Carlo Rovelli. And well, the point of view of these authors is precisely is continuing, the physics, the quantum physics, but more focusing, for instance, about a question of time. And in this sense, well, they are following of the theory of relativity, aggregate theory of relativity. But the problem that you put, it's precisely questioned by them, in the sense that the time constitutes the subjectivity in such a sense. And well, if we consider that the contemporary studies, contemporary research determine the fact that that time is just a consequence of our proximity to a mass, and also is a consequence of a different kind of a mass. We know what happens, for instance, in the case of an observer that is put more in proximity to the land, to the soil, and afar from the soul, with the experience of our astronauts. So this fact also question, well, the idea that the observer can be precisely the same. They resume, that observer can say I am the same, but I'm not yet the same. No, because precisely in the idea that we are continually in a sort of relation, no, with our perception of space and our perception of mass. And so, for instance, Carlo Rovelli, in one of his last book, The Order of Time, precisely defined the idea that we need of a relational idea of objectivity, in which we must create, or we must define a function in which the observer is not just a point, as for instance Paul determined, but the point of view of the observer is in itself a relation. So the fact that the objectivity ever escapes to us can be also determined through the existence of a function that define this relation that can never be the same. So in the sense, now following your reasons, I just can question now if our idea of objectivity just be completely transformed, you know, in a sort of a new scientific revolution, as that determined Galileo's or Copernicus. And well, in this sense, you know, this idea, you know, that also our conception of the observer can be completely revolutionized and can be legitimated also by, you know, the notions of Kuhn, you know, in the structure of scientific revolutions, where it precisely says that the conduct of the observer, of course, is not ever a neutral conduct, because also his or her choices are determined by the models in which his conduct, her conduct was formed. So the fact that we need of observers that can be disposal to accept a different form of models, and even I don't know, the fact that something now different can appear in the experience, and the fact that something new appears also can define new models or new ways to approach not simply an experiment in itself, but the point of view of the observer, as for instance in the loop quantity, in the loop quantum gravity appends. So the spiritual exercise can be defined as the same following Godot, but the conduct of the observers can be transformed just now. Thank you. And you.
Thank you. Well, yes, there's an awful lot of material in that. In your remarks, almost equivalent to another lecture, I think. But I'll take up a couple of themes. First of all, when you mentioned Kuhn, I think that one of the more interesting aspects of Kuhn, whom I follow to a large extent, is a point that was made by Weizsäcker. Weizsäcker said that, speaking about the relations between science and philosophy, generally, when scientists go on with their normal science, which, as Kuhn points out, consists in solving problems, they have no need for philosophy. My wife's a scientist, and I have quite a bit of scientists, and scientists simply don't use or take philosophy into account in their day-to-day work. Now, this changes in times of scientific revolutions. When the contradictions of a scientific view, according to Kuhn, accumulate to a certain extent, and a paradigm shift comes about, then, says Weizsäcker, that's when philosophy is absolutely essential. And I think that there are certain indications in contemporary scientific results that indicate that we might be in one of those periods where we might be on the verge of a new scientific revolution. Now, the specific examples you adduce, I think it would be a little bit misleading to suggest that there is one unified view of reality presented by contemporary, like most cutting-edge science. When you speak of loop quantum gravity, for instance, yes, you have on the one hand Carlo Rovelli, who argues about basically that our notion of time is more or less illusory. But then you have Lee Smolin, who comes up with a huge book to deny that that's the case and to claim that time is a fundamental reality that we absolutely have to take account on. And you have people like Smolin who want, in a certain sense, to rehabilitate Einsteinian realism, really. Think that quantum mechanics is incomplete and there might be some hidden variables after all, and that and those who don't believe it. Then you have others like Rovelli, who, as you say, tend towards a kind of relationism, to the extent that he thinks that the most relevant contemporary, not contemporary, but the most relevant philosophy for describing the findings of quantum mechanics would be that of Nagarjuna, the Buddhist thinker. Of course, that sort of raises the question, if everything is just a matter of relations, what does it mean for there to be only relations without anything to which they're related to? That's a problem I have in understanding Rovelli's particular views. And in general, I think it's very interesting to see that there's always been a tendency in physics to deny the reality of time, largely because the variable of time doesn't occur in the basic equations of physics. You can reverse them all, and they're just as true as they are, as if they were in the direction of the forward nature of time. In contrast, other sciences, biology and chemistry, emphasize the basic reality of time. So what's going on here? I personally think that a way in the direction of a possible solution might be this Bohrian notion of complementarity. That perhaps time is real depending on the kinds of questions we ask. We have to assume that time is real. If we try to ask other questions, then perhaps time is not so real. And I think that this notion of complementarity, which implies that reality is so complex that we have to adopt differing and sometimes even apparently contradictory methods of approach to it, I think is perhaps one of the most possible promising solutions or ways out of our current problems. Don't know whether, I'm sure I haven't addressed all your questions, but I did the best I could.
No, thank you very much. We have time to discuss. Got it. Again.
Okay.
Thank you. Welder, Teldo?
Thank you very much for the presentation. This was very stimulating, and I find fascinating all this groundbreaking work you are doing of bringing together philosophy as a way of life and science. And I found also this discussion of disinterestedness in ancient philosophy and this final idea of homonymy, of objectivity, very stimulating for my own reflections. I have two clarification questions, I think, regarding aspects of these two notions. So regarding disinterestedness and the connection with the self, with the piccolo self, and then how that connects with objectivity, I was wondering what you make of the fact that what is opposed to the piccolo self, or what is overcome, corresponds to a higher self, which you could also think of a higher subjectivity and not necessarily an objectivity. So much of my reflection about this is also influenced by German idealism or German philosophy in general, where there are these alternative ways of thinking of subjectivity that is not only connected with the piccolo self, but with a richer concept of objectivity that shares some of the characteristics that are traditionally attributed to objectivity. And the second question concerns the homonymy of objectivity regarding ancient philosophy in particular. So part of your argument was that by putting in question the notion of objectivity, the ancient models of philosophy are all put in question. If I understood correctly, this is the point where you were departing. But this seems for me to apply pretty well to Epicureanism and Stoicism, where the connection between logic, physics, and ethics is very tight, and they have this view of how nature is constituted, that it is very central to ethical orientation. It does not seem so clear for to me when we think about Plato or even Aristotle, at least concerning the ethics or moral life. And in these cases, at least for instance in Plato, it seems more relevant to talk of an ethical objectivity, or the objectivity of the forms, especially the ethical forms. And then we have Socrates and ancient skepticism, as you mentioned, that seem to me to belong to this tradition of epistemic modesty. You mentioned skepticism in this context, but not Socrates. I was wondering if you see Socrates also as a part of this, and this might even give a mixed status to Plato. Where would he fit in this? So question is also these different levels where not everything is dependent on objectivity in this sense, or not everything is put in question by this criticism of the idea of objectivity in quantum physics.
Thanks so much for your questions. Yeah, I'll answer the second part first. When I was talking about objectivity, I think I was concentrating on Pierre Hadot's views rather than so much on what may actually have been the case in ancient philosophy. Although I think that Hadot's views are basically correct, that it was very important. I'm not sure I see how one could deny that in at least some kind of sense of objectivity, Plato and Aristotle were objectivists. They believe there is an external reality out there which exists independent of our knowledge of it, and that our goal, the goal of our pursuit of knowledge, should try to be to obtain as precise relation, an accurate relation to that objective reality as possible. For me, that's what I understand by objectivism, and surely what Plato was all about. Is obtaining precisely a view of reality as it is in itself, and that's I think is another meaning of objective. Now, the opposite of a non-objectivist would say that the idea of reality as it is in itself has no meaning. Our reality just is what we perceive it to be, what each individual perceives it to be. So I think that they are objectivists in that way. As far as Socrates is concerned, given the pretty well impossible nature of the Socratic question, that is to say, what was the historical Socrates like, considering that we have vastly different reports on what Socrates was like from our main historical sources, Aristophanes, Xenophon, and Plato, I decline to speculate on what Socrates might have thought. And there were, as you know, at least two radically different interpretations of him in subsequent philosophy, as a sort of a skeptic in that early academic and skepticism philosophy, and as a dogmatist in the development of Platonism. So even if the ancients, who were a lot closer in time to Socrates than we are, couldn't agree on what Socrates thought actually was, I don't think we have much of a chance of doing so either. But that's just my view. As far as the relation of German idealism is concerned, yeah, I'm not an expert on that field, but I think the mixture of subjectivism and objectivism is interesting. I'm not sure that that's what Hadot was on about, and I think that there would be some dangers in that regard. Some scholars have pointed to, even going back as far to Kant in this pre-critical work, that the basic idea of German idealism is that we somehow produce reality from ourselves. And it seems to me that that is more in line with the classical physical view of reality as something that is separate from human beings. We can sort of, reality is the way it is according to Kant because of the categories of our understanding. But I think an objectivist view would reply, and this, I think Hadot would be inclined to this more objectivist view, and I am too. Reality does exist. It is out there. We may or may not be able to know it, but it's not correct to think that and not only is it not correct, but it's somehow arrogant to think that we somehow participate in the actual construction of reality. Reality doesn't need us in order to exist. It's up to us to try to obtain some cognizance of the way things are in themselves. So, but once again, these are my simply, what shall I say, my personal inclinations, not based on a profound knowledge of German idealism.
Thank you very much.
Most welcome.
We have 3 further questions, and I need to ask you to be brief from now on. Luis Aguiar de Souza.
I'll be brief because I have to, I apologize in advance, I have to leave after Professor Michael Chase answers me. So thank you very much, Professor. It was, yeah, it was great because I'm more theoretically lean, so this falls more on the theoretical side. And although I'm not really a specialist in contemporary science, philosophy of science, but I'll go through. It's 4 issues, but I'll go through them. I'll leave time for the other questions. So, first question, which is very easy to answer, is what exactly is the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics? So I'm not acquainted with that notion. And okay, I'll say the other, and you choose what to comment. The other one is just to be picky about those sometimes interpretations, clumsy interpretations of history of philosophy. I don't think that Merleau-Ponty could be put in the same side as Bergson in regard of the disinterestedness of aesthetic experience. I think that he has a more view of aesthetic perception as a return to a pre-objective perception without the prejudices of that we normally carry into when we into perception when we analyze it. But never mind, that was not really the topic of your talk. So it's just a side comment. So I would also, if you could give some references, just like a book or something about, just to get into this question about quantum physics or the philosophy of quantum physics. So the other one has to do with it's more like to try to go into the core of your presentation. Wouldn't you think that you still have to distinguish between a kind of ethical disinterestedness and the theoretical or scientific disinterestedness, because you seem to conflate the two, which is also what, if you are a Platonist, of course, the true is the good, or the good is the true. So you have to conflate them. But if someone like Kant, for example, would distinguish these 2 types of disinterestedness, and if you distinguish them, there is not so much. I think that the impact of quantum physics on the philosophy as a way of life wouldn't be that great. And then, yeah, that's it. Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure that I understood the last part of your question there. You said that I was conflating ethical and theoretical disinterestedness. I tried to explicitly distinguish.
You didn't consider that could be 2 types of disinterestedness that aren't really real.
Well, I did actually. I had a slide devoted to that, to different kinds of disinterestedness. I think everyone would agree that there are different kinds of disinterestedness, and that was my point in making that slide. Kant is too, but surely they are not so different that they had nothing in common. If they were, then why would Kant be interested in mentioning them at all? There must be some kind of an implication between them, I think. And then the point would be to try to figure out exactly what the connection is between ethical and disinterest and theoretical disinterestedness. Yeah, so that would require further scrutiny, I think. As far as the Copenhagen philosophy is concerned, the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, I can't possibly describe it in the few moments that we have here. I think it's still the standard interpretation of quantum physics, although there are an awful lot of different interpretations and some many different ones. I would recommend a recent book by Philip Ball, which is entitled, I think it's called Quantum Weirdness or something like that. I don't have it on my bibliography, but if you look up a book by Philip Ball on quantum mechanics, it's quite good. What else can I say? Oh yes, I'm not sure, once again, that I understand what your objection is to associating Merleau-Ponty and Bergson. Both of them surely do have this view that through the aesthetic experience, we can overcome, to use your words, those prejudices that we have, because as Bergson states, our perceptual apparatus puts blinders on us that cause us to pick out those aspects of reality that are relevant to us and may be either potentially dangerous or beneficial to us. And that's all that we pay attention to. Whereas if we concentrate on art, according to Merleau-Ponty, we can obtain some kind of a view of the way that reality emerges. And that in that sense, we are stepping out of our piccolo self and no longer concentrating exclusively on the things that have on viewing reality in terms of that which can be of interest to us. And that, I think, is another aspect of disinterestedness.
So I didn't want to take issue with that. It's just I think that description fits there so much better than Merleau-Ponty, but we are not discussing Merleau-Ponty's interpretation here, so thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Misko?
Okay.
And then again, your name badly pronounced, I know, so sorry for that.
Okay, no, do not be sorry. Am I heard?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
that's great. Well, firstly, of course, I have to thank you, Professor, for inspiring lecture. When I think about physics, I almost always remind to myself Heisenberg's reflection that he thinks, I found quotation now, so I will read it, that the modern physics has definitely decided in favor of Plato. My first thought is that you have wonderfully explained why the best modern physicists, as e.g. this Heisenberg or my favorite Penrose, are Platonists, and why Addo started with Wittgenstein and his thesis 5.6. But isn't in this case the division between objective and real is actually very similar to Plato's or even Parmenides' conception, only with quite a reverse definition of words. Heisenberg's objective is real for Plato, whereas Heisenberg's real is only some kind of aesthesis for Plato. And the two ways of Parmenides seem similar too. So maybe we do not even need to revive Neoplatonism or Neoplatonism, but just as always, this Whitehead to make next footnotes to Plato. And hence my question, is this interpretation completely wrong? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure that it's completely wrong. It's certainly very stimulating and interesting. I think when Heisenberg speaks about Plato being right, and we remember that he was reading the Timaeus in Greek by the age of 15, so he knew his Plato pretty well. He thought, I think he was most impressed by the fact that the five Platonic solids exhibit a kind of symmetry, which he believes is at the basis of quantum mechanics as well. That, I think, was his most, where he believed that Plato was most relevant to quantum mechanics. Now, as far as the real and the objectives are concerned, if I understood you correctly, you're saying that there's a reversal going on, so that what Heisenberg considers as objective, in other words, that quantum state prior to observation, would correspond to the world of Platonic forms. Am I interpreting you correctly?
Yeah, quite okay.
I think that's very interesting. I once amused myself by studying Plato, Proclus's commentary on the Parmenides, and he gives a list of the qualities of the incorporeal. And a lot of those aspects of the incorporeal seem to coincide with the way quantum mechanics tells us the quantum world is. Things can be in two places at one time, and so forth and so on. So I think that's a very interesting idea. And Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Heisenberg's student, wrote some very interesting, after the war, he recycled himself as a philosophy professor. And he wrote some very interesting books on Plato. And he sort of points in that direction too, that basically the Platonic world of ideas may have a lot of features that seem to correspond to the features of reality as revealed by quantum mechanics. I think that's a very, very promising and interesting field for research. So yeah, I think you put your finger on something important there, I think.
So anyway, maybe Leibniz's micro ideas or monads are pointing the same way. Leibniz somewhere between Plato and quantum physics in some way.
But the difference there, of course.
I don't know Leibniz as good as Plato,
well, yeah, the difference there, of course, is that the difference there, of course, is that Leibniz's monads are windowless, and each of them is isolated and without contact to the other. I don't think either quantum mechanics or Plato or Hadot, for that matter, would agree with that. But
yes,
there are a lot of things that Leibniz has in common with contemporary science and complexity studies in particular.
Okay, last question now, very quickly, because we are running out of time. Renata Souza.
Thank you, Professor Chase, for your talk. It was very instructive and helpful for me. So my question comes from the field where I'm working, which is the intersection between philosophy as a way of life and education pedagogy. So I wonder if you could expand on the very end of your talk about the need for developing other faculties rather than pure reason that have been forgotten in modern times. And specifically, if you see this happening right now, and in which fields, and how you see this happening. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. I actually don't see that happening very much. I think it's a field in research that needs to be developed more. We get into a difficult, thorny series of problems here, because when one says, as I do, that perhaps reason, quote unquote, is maybe not the answer to all our questions, then a lot of people's hackles start to be raised. People start getting scared. They say, oh, well, you must be an irrationalist. You must be I don't know, an esotericist or something like that. I think that we need to do a lot of preliminary work before we could even go that way. I think we need to understand better what we mean by reason. We just say, oh, this is Hadot. It's often said Hadot doesn't use reason enough. Well, what do we mean when we say that? What exactly is reason? I think we're hindered by the poverty of the English language here. The Greeks had a variety of words that correspond to our reason, what we call reason, nous, sometimes translated as intellect, dianoia, discursive reason, logos, which can mean a whole variety of things according to the context. They were certainly not under the illusion that there was a single thing called reason, and either we use it or we don't, and that which uses it is good and that which does not use it is bad. This is all, we're much too simplistic when we speak about reason. And the Neoplatonists thought that there were a whole series of faculties that correspond to our reason, and that the highest one of them, which they sometimes spoke of as the one within us, or the flower of the intellect, is what we need to use if we're going to just discover and perhaps assimilate to and perhaps communicate to a certain degree ultimate reality, which is beyond reason, which is in Neoplatonism. In Neoplatonism, it holds a relatively modest position. Reason, it's great, absolutely essential, but it's not the ultimate. So what faculties and medieval traditions went into some detail to try to figure out what faculty this might be that would allow us to conceive of the ultimate reality. And I think now that quantum mechanics tells us that we need different faculties to perceive the most modest, the most fundamental, the most basic parts of reality too, on the smallest scales. Now, are there tendencies in that direction? Very relatively few, I think, precisely because we're still stuck in this paradigm of the predominance of reason, by which we mean something very historically specific and perhaps a distorted view of what the ancients held was reason. So I think, in other words, almost everything remains to be done in this view.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
I guess it's now time to close the session, not before thanking once again to Michael Chase for the generosity with which he accepted to give this talk, and for the fascinating talk and discussion. It was really great. So thank you, Michael, and all of you for being present. As I said at the beginning, we will now have a summer break in our series of seminars, and we'll be back in September. For the ones who are in Portugal, let me tell you that there will be a last philosophical talk this Saturday in Torrão, a small village in Alentejo. This talk is dedicated to philosophy and spirituality, and it will count with the presence of Professor José Eduardo Franco and Fabrizio Boscaglia, and it will be moderated by Gianfranco Ferraro. And finally, I also wish to announce, it's my pleasure to announce that there will be a big final conference of this project in October, more exactly from the 16th to the 18th of October, 3-day conference with the presence of most team members and consultants. Our aim is to basically to present and discuss the main outputs of our project in the last year and a half. And it will be a hybrid event, so participation is possible both in person and online. I will leave you the link here in the chat, and I hope to see you there, either in person or remotely, but please save the dates. In the meantime, I wish you all happy summer holidays, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you. Thanks to all the participants.
Thank you very much.